Okay. All right.
Mhm.
So I know there are various age prediction programs, I guess. I know telomere age is one prediction, and then there's methylation. Are there other type of age
Yeah.
detection methods?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there have been really crude measurements. Oftentimes talk about in the 20s and 30s when they were saying your biological age was your chronological age was 1 year for every pack per day you smoked. So really crude measurement. Obviously those improved. As you mentioned, we got telomere length as one of those outputs. But telomere length is, although one of the most well-known hallmarks of aging and biomarkers of aging, it's generally not that predictive of outcomes. It doesn't, if someone has low telomere length, it doesn't necessarily mean that we know what's actually going to happen to them, if anything. And so these epigenetic clocks are really what I would consider is probably the best biomarker of aging at the moment. And the way that we would judge that is by how predictive they are of negative outcomes. So if you're accelerated in aging, does that increase your risk, or does that, where does that put you? And these tend to be the most predictive. Just to compare to telomere length, for instance, is a good example. They just looked at a Generation Scotland cohort, and they said how much of the phenotypic variation in aging, so everything from disease development to the ability to move and all these different factors that associate with age, how much of that is based on telomere length? And they found that it's right around 2.3%. And then they compared some of the first generation epigenetic clocks, and they found out that that was predictive of right around 28.5%. So as we're comparing the two, the one that is much more predictive of outcomes is going to be these epigenetic methylation clocks. And now some of these newer generation clocks that are built with even more and better data are even more predictive, sometimes explaining over 50% of the difference in those phenotypes of age. So the clocks continue to get better.
So the new clock, is that still using methylation patterns?
It is, but how they train those methylation patterns is a little bit different. And to explain that, it requires maybe a little bit of background, which is that the way that they're using these things or training these things is by taking this methylation data, taking sort of computer learning and artificial intelligence, and then taking an outcome. And they're basically saying, with all of this data, can our computer system predict this outcome? And the problem with that is it's really not intuitive. I think as medical professionals, most people are trained to find pathways that make a lot of sense, where you might say, hey, this is being upregulated or this is being downregulated, and this is leading to X outcome due to that pathway. A lot of the peptides also are addressing these certain pathways and make a lot of intuitive sense in terms of how we think about things. But in the case of these computer learning algorithms, we don't know if it's causal or correlative. We just know that it's predicting X outcome. And so we don't have a lot of reason of why these things are this way. And so the first generation clocks, as I mentioned earlier, were trained to predict someone's chronological age. But the problem with that is that the better that those clocks get, the closer they get to your birthday, which is something we could just ask you for, right? You don't need expensive tests for that, unless you're doing some of those really cool forensic things, as I mentioned earlier. But instead, those are what we call these first generation clocks. And so in order to make a better version of these clocks, what we really want to explain is why someone in their 40s might look 60, right? And why someone in their 60s might look 40. Why are some people living to 100 while other people are not? And so in order to do that, these second generation clocks started to be trained on biological phenotypes, things like blood-based biomarkers, things like telomere length, things like time until death, for instance. And by training these methylation patterns with computer learning to predict those types of phenotypes, these clocks got much better. And the reason we know that they're better is because, again, they're more predictive of outcomes. So this makes a big difference. And then probably the best clock, at least at this point, is a third generation clock, which is trained on biological phenotypes like HDL cholesterol, like gum health, like telomere length and BMI, but it's done it longitudinally on the same patients across their different aging. And that's called the Dunedin Pace algorithm. It's one that we do uniquely here at TruDiagnostic, which was developed at Duke and Columbia University. And that's probably the most predictive. It has some really good associations, not just to death and disease, but also all of these quality of life things that make life worth living, including things like facial aging.